This video is all about a really cool technique in React called the render prop. It's an advanced React pattern that you'll see almost all over the place. So at the end of this lesson, you will be able to pass data to components by way of React Router and the render prop. So we're going to combine these two principles and we're going to leverage the power that the React Router API has given us to be able to pass data now to our components that we're rendering via route. But first, let's find out what a render prop is. So straight from the React documentation, a render prop is a technique for sharing code between React components using a prop whose value is a function. You can go and just Google or follow this link right here and kind of look up what we mean, but you're going to learn all about that right away. Okay, so this function will, in our case, it's going to return a component, in essence, the component that we want to render to the screen. Okay, so when we're using the route component from React Router, we're no longer going to be using the component prop. We're going to be using a render prop on that route component. So what's interesting here is that the match, history, location objects will all need to be passed down explicitly. So that is one of our uses, one of our gotchas with using the render prop versus using the component prop with React Router's route component, is that you will need to explicitly pass down the props that you will receive from React Router. No longer will you get those just out of the box. We're going to show you what we mean by that. Also, you'll need to make sure that you use JSX syntax. Instead of just passing a reference to your component inside of curly braces, when you're using React Router's render prop, you need to actually return the JSX syntax. So this is where it gets a little bit more tricky than what we're used to. So let's see what it looks like. So first off, just take a random component. Path is home. It renders the component of my component. This is something that we're already used to and very, very familiar with. What changes with the render prop is that instead of using the component prop, we use a render prop and we use our curly braces like normal, but we pass an anonymous function whose sole responsibility is to return the component to which we want mounted. And notice that we're using the JSX syntax like mentioned before. And because we're using the JSX syntax, we can now put any explicit props that we want on our component. So this technique is really useful for when you're declaring your route and you have some data in the component by which your route is being declared, and then you want to pass that data to your next component. Well, with the component prop, we didn't have that opportunity. Now with render prop, we do. So going back to what we discussed earlier, the fact that we now have to pass our location, history, and match objects explicitly, we would pass them in like this. So the render prop, the anonymous function that the render prop will take, will receive the props as an argument at some point. Okay? So because of that, we actually we're able to set the match and the history and the location objects from React Router onto our component via props. So this is where the explicit portion of that comes in. Now, this would be very tedious if we had to write match equals props.match, history equals props.history, location equals props.location, especially if this were a class component and we had to use this .props.match and this .props.history and this .props.location. So there's a shortcut. That props object will be equivalent to the props that route will give us. So in our case, match, history, and location. So we can take a shortcut. We can simply spread those props out onto our component implicitly and just say, hey, I want all of the props, match, history, location objects, to be spread out on this component. And this is a little bit more eloquent, a little bit more succinct. And you'll see this pattern everywhere, which is why we're exposing you to it here at Lambda School when you're learning about React Router. Okay. Now, caveats, some very important things to note before we get coding. Render props is not an exclusive pattern to React Router. You will see it in use all over the place. In fact, there is quite a bit of documentation in the reactjs.org docs that you can reference to use this pattern on your own. And they have a really, really cool example that we highly recommend you looking into at some point in the near future when you feel like you actually have free time. Okay, but for now, I want you to open up the link that's in the Code Sandbox right in the follow along section. And it's going to take you to the Code Sandbox to the Avengers app that we've been working on. And we're going to actually use this technique to render out some data, to pass some data down to our components that we're mounting to the screen via the route property. So navigate over to that Code Sandbox link. I'm going to just do it right out of my text editor in my browser, but I want you to follow along in your Code Sandbox. Okay, so here in our text editor, hopefully you were able to navigate over to your Code Sandbox and navigate to this particular portion of the assignment. What we're going to do is we're actually going to refactor our routes so that they will use a render prop instead of using the component prop to mount our components, okay? So, but let's first, before we begin, let's actually talk about why we'd want to do this. Why would we want to make this change in the context of this practical example? Well, in our case, we have some data coming from somewhere for our applications. Normally that's a server, some API that we're calling, and we're accessing a database where data persists. So for us, it's actually just hard-coded into our application. So you probably imported the Avengers array from your data file directly into the Avengers list and the Avenger page components. Hopefully this made you cringe inside just a little bit, because as a React developer, you want to be able to control state or data in one place. In this case, data should be managed in the app component, okay? Then pass to whatever components need them via the props. So let's update our routes so that we can use the render prop so that we're able to actually do this, okay? So notice that we actually have our Avengers, it's on state, it's ready to rock and roll. We're not really passing it around anywhere. So we're gonna actually refactor our route component. Really, we're going to refactor our Avengers list component and our Avenger page so that we can pass that data properly, okay? So instead of using component here, I'm going to delete those two and just type in, whoops, didn't mean to do that. So I'm just going to delete component here and instead use the render prop. Now, what's cool is effectively nothing really has changed in our application except one key important detail that we mentioned during our slide share. So if you look now at your React DevTools, if we were able to get to those components, you would see that we don't have the ability to have access to the history, match, and location objects, okay? So let's go back and let's make sure that we're actually mounting this the appropriate way. So our Avengers list and everything still routes the same. We're still clicking on our links. Our links are taking us to those pages and we're still mounting these components, but we're just gonna mount them now via render props. So I'm just gonna pass props in, and then I'm going to pass this the Avengers list component instead of what we were doing earlier, okay? And then what we're gonna do is I am going to now pass the Avengers that are on state down to this component, okay? And if I look, we have this.state.avengers, okay? So I could just reference this.state.avengers, or I could spread out that state object and say const Avengers, and this is a really common pattern you'll see as well, equals this.state. What this is doing, this is spreading out this property and giving it a name inside of our render function. So now we can just call Avengers as our data, okay? So I'm going to now simply just pass Avengers. And effectively, nothing should have changed if I go to the path /Avengers. I should still get all of these items like normal. But let's browse under the hood and let's take a look at what we're missing. Always take a peek under the hood. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. I think you can still manage to see that. But if you look at our Avengers list component, we no longer have access to the history, match, and location objects that come from React Router, from the route component. So what we need to do is take this props object, okay, and we need to spread it out onto this component. And the way that we do that is, once again, just by using spread operator and destructuring the object, and we're just going to say props. Now if I refresh the page and I take a peek at this component inside of React, and let's look for, we could just search for Avengers list. Now take a look. We actually have those props on our component. So it's as if we just forcefully made React Router mount this component up by way of the way that it used to. But we had to do it explicitly by passing those props in. Okay? So while that's cool, we're going to take a look again, and we're going to do the same thing for the Avenger page. So let me take a look. Let me get a single Avenger here, just so I know exactly what we're working with. Okay? Okay, so Avenger by the ID of 1, which would be Iron Man. Okay, so we're now going to mount this by way of the render prop. Remember, render prop is just a fancy name for a prop whose value is a function. We are going to then also give this the Avenger data, but we want to set that equal to Avenger. I think we just call it Avengers. I'm sorry. Come back here. Avengers equals Avengers. Okay. And notice we got something that broke. Why did we get something that broke? Okay. Well, this is actually because we don't have those props yet. Okay. So it is saying I want to find props.match.params ID. And unfortunately, it's not there because render is being used. The render props paradigm is being used. So we need to explicitly pass those objects down, and hopefully it just fixes itself, and it did. Okay, so now we can actually reference that match object. Okay, so let's go to our components, Avengers list and Avengers page, and let's figure out what we need to do to refactor those. Okay. All right, so now we could just say props.avengers.map instead of using this. And that should go back, and it's just like normal. So let's do the same thing for the single Avenger page, where instead of pulling in that data and passing it around everywhere, we're just going to say props.avengers.find. And everything should work the way that it used to. Okay? All right, so now it's important that you take this time to apply these same principles to your friend's application that you have been working on thus far this week. So remember, every single day we're gonna follow along, and then you're gonna try and do something on your own. So thanks for tuning in. This was a quick lesson on the render props. I hope you really enjoyed it. And please reach out if you have any questions.